Trinidad and Tobago, like many other signatories to the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, had made commitments in 2010 to achieve several biodiversity targets during the decade 2011 to 2020. These are commonly referred to as the Aichi targets. However, the country has found that achieving most of those targets continues to be a work in progress. Kishan Kumarsingh, head of Multilateral Environmental Agreements at Trinidad and Tobago's Ministry of Planning and Development, tells Voices from the Global South that the government is keen on achieving the targets in view of the economic benefits the country expects to derive from having healthy biodiversity. In 2016, in its fifth national report to the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, Trinidad and Tobago estimated that coastal protection services provided by coral reefs, mangroves, and marshes were worth nearly $50 million annually to the country, while the forests in Trinidad's northern range were estimated to provide soil retention services valued at as much as $620 million annually, representing nearly 7% of central government annual revenues. A more recent study completed with the FAO suggests that communities close to forests enjoy a 30% increase in their annual income due to forest-related employment. Though biodiversity in Trinidad and Tobago is coming under increasing pressure, Kumar Singh says the hope is to incorporate the economic value derived from biological diversity and ecosystem services into the country's national development. I am IPS Caribbean correspondent Jewel Fraser, and in this Voices from the Global South podcast, I learn more about Trinidad and Tobago's challenges with regard to achieving these sustainable biodiversity goals.
Okay, so my name is Kishan Kumarsingh. My role as the head of the Multilateral Environmental Agreements at the Ministry is to coordinate and to ensure implementation of the provisions of the MEAs or the Multilateral Environmental Agreements to which Trinidad and Tobago is a signatory and for which the Ministry of Planning and Development is a national focal point. This includes the Convention on Biological Diversity. I also chair the cabinet-appointed committee to implement the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, which has come out of the Convention on Biological Diversity as part of the national obligation. So the Convention on Biological Diversity was one of three multilateral environmental agreements that was adopted at the Rio Conference in 1992 on Sustainable Development. The others being the Convention to Combat Desertification and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Trinidad and Tobago ratified the Convention on Biological Diversity on the 1st of August in 1996. As with all ratifications or participation in multilateral environmental agreements, Trinidad and Tobago's participation seeks to join global efforts at addressing problems that are globally important, such as climate change, land degradation, and biological diversity conservation. The objectives of the Convention, therefore, the conservation of biological diversity, the sustainable use of its components, and the fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising out of the utilization of genetic resources. But beyond that, the issue of biological diversity and the threats associated with sustainable use of its resources are perhaps more evident in small and developing states. The reason because in most cases you have a high level of endemism, but beyond that, the pressures of or the characteristics that define small and developing states include competing land uses for housing, for development, basically for farming, for agriculture. It's a driver for loss of biological diversity. So the challenges for small and developing states are perhaps a bit more profound and compounded by these characteristics that define them. So in joining such an agreement, the benefits to be had are very valuable in terms of developing a system or developing approaches to use biological diversity in a sustainable manner.
Okay, thank you. Now, can you sum up for us this country's current status with regard to protecting its biodiversity?
Okay, so the biodiversity of any place, including small island states, dynamic. So you have changes in its structure, in its status, largely resulting of the pressures or from the pressures that are exerted on various biodiversity systems and ecosystems. And these include space for farming, space for agriculture, space for housing, space for community development, for roads, and so on, as well as exploitative in nature for food, including in the marine areas. So therefore, it's not static, but our latest report is in fact, the revised National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, the NBSAP or the NBSAP as it's called, that has looked at the status and the state of the various types of biodiversity and so on. With respect to that, it provides a state of threats that are associated with biodiversity and its sustainable use. And it's precisely because of those threats that we have adopted the 12 targets under the NBSAP for trying to achieve sustainable use of the biodiversity. So it's not a sort of clear-cut answer to say that the current status is good or bad. It's a continuous effort to reassess and continue to assess the status of biodiversity and the threats associated with human development, and to provide recommendations for intervention options to ensure sustainable use so that biodiversity is not under any existential threat.
Okay, I see what you're saying. The government of Trinidad and Tobago did provide some measures, some quantifiable targets for ensuring a healthier biodiversity profile for Trinidad and Tobago. So perhaps we could look at a few of those targets, and we could perhaps then get some sense of where Trinidad and Tobago is right now with regard to biodiversity. So I'd like to look at a few of those targets now, and if you could speak to them. So to begin with, so for example, one of the targets that they mentioned is that by 2020, the rate of loss of all natural habitats, including marine habitats, is at least halved, and degradation and fragmentation is significantly reduced. So where are we now with that? What is the rate of loss of these habitats right now, 2020?
Right. So maybe it might be appropriate to put this question along with the other questions that you may have on the targets we've set ourselves in a broader context, so that it provides for a logical and sensible response. The Aichi targets, the Convention on Biological Diversity, adopted what are called the Aichi targets because it was adopted in Aichi in Japan in 2010. At the 10th meeting of the Conference of the Parties to the CBD. That provided a 2011 to 2020 strategic plan for biodiversity. As you would imagine, this was a global set of objectives for sustainable use, as it was provided for under Article 6 of the Convention. Aichi targets is for the 2011 to 2020 period, which was aimed at a global effort, and for which nations will now have to implement. We adopted our revised NBSAP for the period 2017 to 2022, which is a 5-year period. The implementation of the NBSAP is now underway, and I'll get into it a little bit more, for the period 2017 to 2022. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So what we have done is we are a little bit behind in terms of the NBSAP for achieving those 2020 targets that were agreed to globally. That does not mean that we are not achieving or implementing what we said we would achieve, but we have aligned the targets to say 2020 in keeping with the broader global Aichi targets. And so we have already gone past 2020, but we are still in the process of implementing the targets with those quantified targets in mind, but not 2020, because it clearly cannot be achieved in 2020, because the NBSAP itself is from 2017. The revised NBSAP now defines a period for achieving those targets between 2017 and 2022.
So what you're saying is that the Aichi targets for 2011 to 2020, they have been revised and placed in a new program for 2017 to 2022, where it is hoped that the targets revised from the 2011 to 2020 targets will be achievable in the 2017 to 2022 period. Am I understanding you correctly?
Yes, but with some further clarification, those targets in the revised MBSAP are for Trinidad and Tobago only. So they are our targets that came out of the global targets, the Aichi targets that were set for 2011 to 2020. So the idea is to implement those targets that we have set ourselves in the period 2017 to 2022, but not keeping the 2020 deadline in a strict adherence. The reference to 2020 at the time of developing the strategy and action plan, because we had some time then, was also for the purposes of aligning with the Aichi targets that were for 2020.
Great, thank you. I understand that the main threats to Trinidad and Tobago's biodiversity are, as you said, agriculture, housing, and industry. I've understood you correctly on that point, correct?
But there are many threats, not necessarily isolated or restricted to those three areas. But yes, those are some of the three drivers of biodiversity degradation. But threats to biodiversity are global and local. So for example, climate change, the impacts of climate change globally that will impact on small and developed states, including Trinidad and Tobago, is also an overarching threat to biological diversity that has nothing to do with the local drivers of space for agriculture, for example, or housing, or industry, or roads, or anything like that. But they are included, but it's not necessarily restricted to those three sectors that you have identified in the local context.
Climate change is a work in progress dealing with that. However, the issues with agriculture, housing, and industry, those are long-standing issues, and they are important components of Trinidad and Tobago's development. And as any country in the global south, Trinidad and Tobago is very concerned about development. How do you reconcile the demands for land for agriculture, the demands for housing, which is a huge demand in Trinidad and Tobago, as we know, and the impacts of industry, such as the all-important oil and gas industry in Trinidad and Tobago? How do you reconcile the demands and the impacts of those and the need for Trinidad and Tobago to continue to develop with the demands or the requirement to safeguard biodiversity? Because it's a push and pull.
Well, this is a challenge that is not unique to Trinidad and Tobago. I think this is a challenge for many countries, if not all countries, but particularly so for small island developing states, where you have this need for space, need for development, need for enhancing human well-being and affluence against the need for environmental and biodiversity conservation. So it's not a situation that is unique to Trinidad and Tobago, but particularly challenging small and developing states like Trinidad and Tobago. So given those competing needs and those challenges, the objective then is to, as you have correctly pointed out, to balance developmental needs with sustainable biodiversity and sustainable environmental services. And to do that, there are several approaches that the government has undertaken over the years. So the regulatory process, the regulatory framework for ensuring that environmental balance with development is there in law under the Environmental Management Act and the Certificate of Environmental Clearance process. There are other subsidiary legislation, for example, that also may have relevance to minimize impact on biological diversity. So, for example, the water pollution rules that limit effluents from activities. The air pollution rules, which also does the same for air pollution, act in tandem and in concert with the Certificate of Environmental Clearance process to ensure that you have that balance between need for development and the types of development with ensuring environmental sustainability, including biological diversity.
Thank you for sharing that. We live in Trinidad and Tobago. We know that there are many laws on the books, but the implementation and the enforcement of the laws is a different matter. So it's not always a comfort to persons when they're faced with threats to their environment, as has happened, as we've seen in the news. It's not always a comfort to know that there are these provisions in the Act and in the laws to protect the environment, because it doesn't always work out that way. So if you could just share with us, in simple layman's terms, one or two concrete examples of work being done or of provisions being made to ensure that, for example, the increasing demand, the ever increasing demand for housing will not have an adverse impact on the environment.
Implementation and full implementation and effective implementation of any law, whether related to environmental issues or not, is usually a challenge. And no one can claim anywhere, I guess, anywhere in the world that they have 100% implementation and therefore 100% efficacy of that implementation of any law. Trinidad and Tobago is no different, but the landscape already provides for, the legislative landscape already provides for, as I alluded to, the EM Act and the Certificate of Environmental Clearance process specifically, as well as town and country planning approvals that are required for built environment. So those two institutions really are the institutions that are charged with, under the law, for providing approvals, and in the provision of those approvals, issues related to environmental impact, including on biodiversity, are taken into consideration. But let me suffice it to say that that the implementation of laws is not without redress to affected parties, as how all legal frameworks and all legal systems operate. But ensuring compliance and policing compliance is always a challenge. But we are always seeking ways through policy and through enhanced legislation and through novel legislation to enhance the compliance regime that serve to meet the objectives of environmental sustainability. So it's an iterative process where we go through. It's dynamic because, again, the pressures that are exerted on the environment by way of developmental demands in a small and developing state, which is particularly challenging because of the limited space. And balancing those things have to be continually assessed and reassessed with the gaps identified, so that recommendations can be made where there may be gaps in the law, for example, gaps in policy, for example, to enhance the existing implementation efforts, because capacity issues is always a challenge. Human capacity is always a challenge to do this. Financial capacity, technological capacity is always a challenge in doing this. But the effort is always an ambitious, raising and progressive agenda towards tightening the laws where there may be gaps, or tightening the policies where there may be gaps, or tightening the implementation and compliance where there may be gaps. So it's a work in progress with that aim in mind.
Great. So that ties in with the number one item in the revised targets for the Trinidad and Tobago government for biodiversity, which is that at least 50% of people are aware of the values and understanding of biodiversity, and at least 30% of people are aware of the steps they can take to conserve and use biodiversity sustainably. In other words, you can legislate, but if people are not willing to comply, then it becomes very difficult. So there does need to be buy-in by the population for these efforts to protect the biodiversity.
Absolutely. And I think that is perhaps the biggest challenge in any environmental effort that the government may be embarking on. Compliance is always an issue. And sensitization, public awareness, and public education, the theory is that if you're educated and if you sensitize about the impacts of some of your actions, that education will drive a behavioral change. That is not necessarily always the case, or there's no fixed linear relationship between the two. So that ensuring that the people are aware, that they are sensitized, is always an underlying and underpinning effort in any environmental program. Because human beings are by nature human beings, and it's not always easy to do the right thing, while at the same time it's not always right to do the easy thing. Targeting that aspect is always a challenge, and it's always an ongoing challenge. And that is why for those targets that we've identified, 1A and 1B, as I had alluded earlier, the committee has developed a monitoring and evaluation framework for integrating efforts in all agencies And those two targets, 1A and 1B, is part of that. So therefore, we will be embarking on monitoring and evaluating the achievement of those targets, including those related to awareness and understanding of biodiversity, but broadly environmental issues, because everything is entwined.
I'm also interested in learning a little bit about the Tobago Main Ridge Forest Reserve, one of the most important carbon sinks, perhaps the most important in Trinidad and Tobago. Can you tell us a little bit about what's being done in regard to that, and if there are any special plans in relation to it?
Right. Okay. So it's well known that the Main Ridge is the oldest forest reserve in the Western Hemisphere since the 1700s. What we have done, we have recognized it as a biodiversity hotspot, if you want, but as well an area that provides significant ecosystem services for climate regulation. In fact, that was the basis on which it was designated so many hundred years ago. As a protector of the rains, I think it was, to quote verbatim. There is a recognition of its importance and its ongoing importance, and the need to conserve and preserve its functionality. And one of the efforts is to ensure that the boundaries have been properly marked and delineated, so that management measures can be undertaken within those boundaries. We have worked with the Tobago arm of forestry within the division responsible for forestry, and have trained them to look at it. And it's an ongoing process where that delineation and that mapping will be hopefully completed as we go on.
I understand that the Ministry of Planning and Development worked with the FAO in an exercise to determine the socioeconomic value of the ecosystems in Trinidad and Tobago. Can you tell us a bit about that exercise and maybe highlight some of the results?
Right. Some of the rationale for looking at ecosystems and their values is a foregone conclusion. But one of the long-term objectives would be to incorporate these economic valuations, if you want, into the national capital assessment. So where we want to go to now is, having done part of that exercise, is to actually bring to the fore the capital value into the sort of the national capital assets that goes beyond some of the mineral resources that we have accustomed to valuating, that actually bring in hard currency, whereas the economic value of ecosystem services, the valuation of the ecosystems are now given a monetary value, which are proxy values, of course. But the real significance of assigning those values is really the sustainability aspect of it, because here you have a system that if managed properly and sustainably can generate income going beyond or going forward. If you compare to the finite aspects of other types of resources, such as mineral resources, the gas and the oil, for example, those are being depleted. It will run out. But here is something, a service, an ecosystem service by biodiversity that will, once managed sustainably, can generate the kind of income into perpetuity once it's managed properly. So apologies for not giving you a fixed value, but the real significance in assigning those values is to now demonstrate sort of long-term sustainability and long-term income generation power that can be derived from the economic value of the ecosystem services, such as livelihoods, tourism, providing food on a sustainable basis. So when you compare, for example, a coral reef or a mangrove system that provides food on its own, compared to an agricultural system where humans manually have to go in and till the land, plant the seeds, harvest, invest in technology for post-harvest technology, distribution and marketing, and so on. You understand how the balance between effort and benefit is juxtaposed, and where you really find the real value in economic services provided by biodiversity.
So given all that you've just said, what are the government of Trinidad and Tobago's plans for incorporating ecosystems valuation into the development plan? Or what ways have they identified that they can use the value of these ecosystems to replace development practices that are having an adverse impact on the biological diversity?
Well, one of the ways of effective decision making is to have the data, the scientific data, the information at hand. But more than having it at hand, to have it in a comprehensive and usable manner for decision making. So the valuations part of the of ecosystems, getting that those values, incorporating it into the national asset base, are the tools that will now inform um, the government in terms of how it goes forward with its developmental plans. If you look at the current National Development Plan, for example, you see under Theme 5 that says it places the environment at the center of social and economic development, which is a recognition in itself that the environment and all that goes with it forms the core, or around it revolves all aspects of socioeconomic and physical development and economic development. So part of effective decision making will be having the information, having the data, which is now being collected through many of these programs and projects that you have identified, so that going forward, such decision making will now be empowered by that data and information in line with some of the policy objectives of the government, so that that incorporation of environment and economic development has already been sort of reconciled as to how the development paradigm is going to be pursued. So we're in a very exciting time for environmental governance in Trinidad and Tobago.
Okay, so thank you very much for sharing that with us. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
This is Jewel Fraser speaking to Kishan Kumarsingh, Head of Multilateral Environmental Agreements at the Ministry of Planning and Development in Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you for listening to this Voices from the Global South podcast.